This is Jack Wyatt in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Jack, Wyatt, fantastic, you guys. All right, it's 1 here on the East Coast, so I'm going to go ahead and put everyone on mute. And as always, we'll get our call started on time. Everyone's now on mute, but when the time comes for questions or comments, I'll tell you how to request unmuting so we can call on you. My name's Azer Cole. I'm one of 2 citizen empowerment coordinators here at American Promise. And a warm welcome to everyone to the American Promise National Citizen Leader Call for November of 2018. This is a call that happens on the second Saturday of each month. And I just want to thank everyone who's taken the time out of their busy weekends to join us today. Or maybe you couldn't make it live and you're listening to this recording afterwards. Either way, you're stepping up to save our democracy. So a big thank you to you. We're just honored to have an incredible guest speaker today, Yael Bromberg. She's a law professor specializing in voting rights and civil rights and an expert on the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting ages, some of you might remember, from 21 to 18. And after we hear from Yael, we'll hear a grassroots victory from American Promise's very own Ben Gubitz, Director of Political Strategy, all about the recent Massachusetts 28th Amendment statewide ballot initiative victory. Yes, victory, which not only passed with 71% of the statewide vote, but passed with a majority in each and every city and town, 351 cities and towns. Really just a phenomenal victory and one of many that happened all across the country last week. Afterwards, we'll go into this month's action, which is writing letters to the editor, urging voters to stay civically involved now that the election is over with groups like American Promise. We'll finish the call with a quick training on how to set up Google alerts with your local newspapers as a way to monitor for money and politics related coverage, which could be a powerful tie-in for writing letters to the editor supporting a 28th Amendment. So again, thanks everyone for stepping up. And if you're interested in learning more about what it takes to start an American Promise Association or an APA in your community, please send me an email at azorc@americanpromise.net. That's azorc@americanpromise.net. And normally at the start of these calls, we share a quote, but for this call, I wanted to share a sentiment I heard from a participant at the recent Knoxville American Promise Association launch last month. And as we were going around the room sharing a little bit about why we were here, someone explained, quite profoundly, I thought, that we're not divided red versus blue. We're not divided Republican versus Democrat. The divide in this country is between moneyed interests and the majority of Americans. And that really resonated with me, that the divide isn't red versus blue. It's not Republican versus Democrat. And that money in politics is really this foundational issue affecting so many others. And luckily, it's one that people of all political stripes can actually agree on, which makes working together so key. And that's really what these calls are all about. And I'm particularly excited for this one because I get to introduce Yael Bromberg, a distinguished scholar, a skilled litigator, and proven democracy leader. She's an attorney and a teaching fellow focused on civil rights and voting rights litigation with the Institute for Public Representation at Georgetown Law. She previously worked with Common Cause on litigation, legislative research, and policy related to democracy law. Bromberg's a historical expert on the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, and will share insights from the successful campaign to help us with ours, winning the 28th Amendment to get big money out of politics. And Yael, before I turn it over to you, I just want to give you an idea of the kind of people who you're talking with on this call. You're talking with people like Kim Wass and Nancy Heselton, 2 volunteers who spearheaded the successful statewide ballot initiative in Massachusetts I just talked about, collecting over 130,000 signatures, generating local and national press coverage, and leading a team of over 200 volunteers in this truly historic effort. You're talking to people like Judy Butler, the leader of the Delaware American Promise Association, who was recently invited to speak at a political gathering of lawyers, professors, and authors about the problem of money in politics, and far more importantly, about the solution a 28th Amendment would bring. So that's an idea of the kind of folks who you're talking with here, people who know that even though the midterms have ended, our work as citizens has not. Really true heroes. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Yael, and as she's talking, everyone, please be thinking of questions for her afterwards, and you can raise your hand by pressing 1 on your keypad, and I will moderate Q&A afterwards. So Yael, huge thank you for being here, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Azer. Am I coming through on the line?
Crystal clear. Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, folks. Thank you so much for having me, Azer and American Promise. I'm a big fan of your work. I've been since you all started, as you know. And one of the things that I am heartened by, which you had mentioned, Azer, is the focus of the 28th Amendment as a unifying principle across partisan lines and really across all lines. And it's a major reason why I'm actually, so focused on the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, because it kind of envelopes the same principles. It's, cross gender lines, cross party lines, cross age lines even. And it's really about expanding the electorate for a more inclusive and representative democracy. And it's really wonderful to hear. Actually, it's helpful for me to hear kind of the folks that are on the other are tuning into this discussion too. My background is in community organizing. It's what motivates my approach to litigation and my general framework. So I really appreciate that there's these super engaged activists and organizers that have found a way kind of to plug in through the American Promise Network, because I think there's just so much promise here, not to be redundant. And one of the things of my focus with the 26th Amendment is, so I have an article that's coming out, a piece of scholarship in the University of Pennsylvania's Journal of Constitutional Law. It's coming out in a few months, and I've been invited to kind of workshop this and discuss this, and folks are really intrigued. Nobody knows what the 26th Amendment is. Folks in the older generations might remember when it was first ratified, and they might remember the spirit of the civil rights movement and the anti-draft movement. And they sort of remember the 26th Amendment unless they were super active, particularly on that issue. But it's still within our popular conscience. We generally understand what it is. We just might not know it. And the spirit of it was really to kind of expand the ballot to young people based on it was heavily influenced by the fact that there was a mandatory military conscription at the time. It was ratified in 1971, so we're approaching the 50-year anniversary of the amendment soon, and 1971. But there were all these other policy reasons for expanding the electorate. It was the sense of increased responsibilities of young people, that they were able to kind of marry, to engage in contracts, to assume debt. These were all general policy reasons in favor of lowering the amendment. It was a bit arbitrary. The 18-year mark is a little arbitrary. It's a relic to the Middle Ages when young boys were deemed strong enough to wear armor. And so that was the original connection to the age of 18. So some folks talk to me about, well, what about, expanding the voting age to 16? Some municipalities have actually done that on the local level. And, I think there's actually some really interesting arguments for that. But based on the kind of arbitrary nature that 18 was at the time of 1971. And a major policy reason at the time, too, which was discussed through the legislative history, was the fact that unlike at the turn of the century, by the time that we as a nation got to 1971, education was standardized. So young people, there was a K through 12 system that was more or less mandatory, and young people their minds were being expanded and educated through that system, coupled with the popularization of television screens that were being introduced into living rooms. So there's this notion that, and even there was some really interesting conversation in the legislative testimony that young people are even more aware than the older age groups because they're so tuned in now through the advent of television. I think that we see that now also even more so through the use of smartphones. So that's kind of another kind of tidbit on the legislative history piece. But what I think is really interesting for folks who are really getting behind the 28th Amendment is this long-term vision that the 26th Amendment informs us as a movement, that this is not something that might win today or tomorrow, although it certainly may be on the local or even potentially statewide level, with other similar, like sister proposals like public financing, or the amazing recent win in Massachusetts. But the path towards ultimate ratification is actually a long one, and it takes a certain amount of tenacity and long-term dedication to the effort. So specifically for the 26th Amendment, it was first introduced in 1942. So again, it was ratified in 1971. So it took 30 years to really reach the tipping point by which it would ultimately pass through Congress. And during that 30-year time period, it had been introduced over 150 times to Congress. There's an interesting kind of historical piece with the 26th Amendment specifically, which is that it had become such a major issue. Ted Kennedy had pioneered it along with others, that they actually were getting so frustrated with the constitutional ratification process that they introduced it as an amendment within the 1970 amendments to the Voting Rights Act. And it ended up taking, I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but basically they took a statutory approach, and ultimately it was a statutory approach that really triggered the ultimate constitutional ratification of the amendment, because it had gone up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld the statutory approach for federal elections, but not for state elections because of issues with federal preemption. And then the country was really in a position facing the upcoming looming McGovern race, in which access to the ballot for 18-year-olds was permitted for federal races, but not for state and local races. And that kind of created this quagmire, first of all, a bureaucratic and like major nightmare, but also this quagmire of, oh, we really need to push this through right now. But by the time that it passed through Congress, it was passed by strong supermajorities across party lines. So it passed the Senate in 1971 unanimously, 94-0, and it passed the House nearly unanimously, 401-19. And then it went through the states, again, because of this sense of urgency, and it was ultimately the quickest amendment to be ratified in U.S. history, where it was ultimately ratified in less than 3 months. It made the sweep to all 38 states, and then states continued to join the effort. So I think now the total count is about 42 states. They joined the effort even after the ultimate ratification went through. And just to show you kind of the flavor of the, across party lines angle of it, President Eisenhower said in 1954 during his State of the Union address that he was in support of this. Again, that was 1954, so that's about 12 to 15 years after it was first introduced to Congress. And ultimately, it was actually President Nixon who signed it into law. Johnson was a big supporter of it. As I said, Ted Kennedy was. And there were really people across the party lines that were really in favor of this effort. And I think that if there's one thing that we can kind of take away for the 28th Amendment is this kind of long-term vision of it, and also an inside Congress and outside Congress approach. So it's simply not the case that there were leaders within Congress that had the foresight to expand it, and that they did it independent of pressure, of the people's pressure from outside of Congress. It's actually the youth involvement in this movement through the 60s certainly owed its legacy to the civil rights movement, when young people were leading and organizing the lunch counter protests, for example, and were leading Freedom Summer for voter registration campaigns in Mississippi and across the board. And they were informed by Ella Baker from the NAACP, who was leading them from behind. But it was really the young people that were at the forefront, and eventually the young people who stepped up into a larger youth franchise coalition, which was extraordinarily diverse and well organized. That was around 1969. But the lunch counter protest started way before that, and eventually the young people kind of carried the torch at the end of the day by themselves. But it was an intrinsic aspect of the Second Reconstruction, and so now, kind of fast forwarding to where we are now, one of the reasons why I think this is so exciting, first of all, is we continue to see ways in which the 26th Amendment the promises of the 26th Amendment have yet to be fulfilled, and that's a subject of my scholarship, in addition to exploring kind of the interesting legislative history of it, and just to kind of give you a very brief overview of that. It's like conflation of the concepts of residency and domicile, which serve as obstacles for young people to register to vote from campuses, for example. It's confusing strict voter identification laws. In some states, you can use a handgun license to vote, but not a student ID. In other states, a faculty can use their faculty ID, but a student can't use their student ID, even though it's issued by the same university. There's the removal of polling places from campuses, coupled with gerrymanders literally through campuses, like in Louisiana State University, where there's a gerrymander that literally goes through the main road of campus, and there's no polling places on any portion of the campus. But this is also just something that we see across, that I think is under-researched and underappreciated, and also the counting provisional ballots. So in half of the states in the country, if a provisional ballot is cast in the wrong polling place due to a gerrymander or a voter confusion about where a voter should go, the entire ballot is tossed, even if the proper polling place is like less than a mile away. And so this has been kind of the subject of my interest and my research, and I could talk on and on about it, but I want to allow us time to go to the Q&A. But, at this point, we're 50 years, or approaching 50 years since ratification in 1971, and this midterm was particularly exciting because folks that have been following this saw that there's been unprecedented engagement by young people accessing the ballot. So in Texas, there was a 5-fold increase of youth participation, the same in Georgia, and in Georgia it was 4-fold, in Nevada it was 5-fold, in Arizona it was 3-fold. And I think that this is an indicator of more to come. And I also think that this is one reason why we have to be very vigilant and watch for potential obstructions that are put in the way of young people accessing the ballot for 2020. And I think that we've seen the what happens when young people access the ballot too, in terms of their enthusiasm and their engagement. There's statistics that show that voting is habit forming, so the more likely you are to engage in accessing the ballot as a young person at age 18, the more likely you are to continue to access the ballot moving forward. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to go for too long, and I'm sure that you guys have some really rich Q&A, and I can kind of address the other points through that too.
Perfect. Thank you, Yael. Thank you for your expertise and your time, and learning from the past to really inform our future as on something as important as a constitutional amendment is just key. So let's open it up for some Q&A. If you have a question, please press 1 on your keypad so I know to call on you. Let's start with Marie Henselder-Kimmel, an APA leader. Marie, where are you calling in from, and what's your question?
Hi, calling from Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Thank you so much for your comments, Yael Bromberg. And I have 2 questions regarding the history of the passage of the 26th. One at our national conference in Washington in June, one of the things that was pointed out is the unusual aspect of the widespread popular support for undoing the effects of Citizens United with an amendment. What was the early popular support like for the 26th, and how did that change? I imagine, of course, it increased as it got closer to ratification. And also, what kept it from being, it was being discussed for so many times and introduced for so many times. What was the block that kept it from being passed in terms of legislation?
This is a really good question. Yeah, thank you. I'm also originally from New Jersey, so I appreciate all the Jersey participants. I forgot to say that at the top of the call. But yeah, so this is actually a really good question. So in 1942, when it was first introduced, it was tied to the wartime, really, efforts. And every time there was a war, there was an uptick in interest around the proposal. So 1942, you know, going like Korean War, Vietnam War, there was always, World War II, there was always an uptick around wartime specifically. But I think that it's really the outside push. So the movements that were organizing during the nation's second Reconstruction that forced the pressure and kind of forced the nation's attention to this issue. And this is about kind of how movements reach tipping points, you know. And there's a great quote that I have from Bill Quigley, who's like myself, a movement lawyer, and he's a clinician in the South, and he does some kind of phenomenal work. And what he describes it, he's almost like if you're watching a pot boil, you don't necessarily know what temperature it's at, and folks participate as organizers or as activists at different points of the pot getting to that boil, but you never really know where you are and how close you are to the boil. And then when you see it, it's, you know, the organizers that are around at the time that say, yes, we got this done. But really this is a part of a longer term effort that kind of all hands on deck have to be engaged in. So even though in 1971 and late 1960s, the Youth Franchise Coalition swept across the country, there was a normalization of this concept. So there were music records put out by some band whose name escapes me that was really popular at the time. They were talking about the franchise. This actually reminds me of Taylor Swift's involvement during the midterms, saying, you know, young people, you have to go out and vote. She has, you know, a ridiculous number of followers on Instagram. She's like kind of reaching her target audience. She has 112 million Instagram followers. And so I think that this question goes to how do we normalize these concepts and educate the public about them. And I think that contributes to kind of the push within Congress that will ultimately be successful. And, you know, you also see this in other examples, kind of these ideas of normalizing concepts. So in the voter suppression litigation, when it was first when the courts were first grappling with it, they were actually agreeing with justifications that states were using to support what we now understand to be voter suppression efforts. But at the time, they were relying on states' representations without kind of trying to peek behind the curtain and really, you know, scrutinize the justifications that were being proposed. And they just said, okay, yes, the state says this is for voter fraud, so this is for voter fraud. And it's only now that we understand that, but that's because of that these ideas have become so normalized in kind of the popular, in the public discourse. So there's an education curve that we have to reach. And I think that that's where we are in American Promise too, that it's about getting the word out, engaging on all states, on all levels, local, state, federal, and also just with friends, family, newspapers, media, et cetera, just educating.
Fantastic. Let's keep turning on the pressure from all angles, having that water boil as quickly as possible. We've got another group leader with his hand up, Jack Wyatt. I'm going to turn it over to you. You're unmuted. Where are you calling in from, and what is your question?
again, this is Jack. I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it's a related question. It's just a matter of saying who was objecting to the amendment, and what objections had to be overcome in that process, and how do you compare those to what we're facing with the 28th Amendment in terms of getting big money out of politics?
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought of it from that perspective. I think that the people that were objecting at the time, there were some folks that were saying, young people are not able enough to engage. So there was that lens, but then there was, to counteract that, there was the sociologist Margaret Mead, and many, various experts were participating in like kind of this normalization. Ultimately, at some point in the 60s, it became so normalized that the discussion was less about the youth voting age, which had at that point almost become like an anachronism. And it was more about the pathway to reform. And so that ended up occupying the discussion. And people who opposed it said, well, we have to do it through amendment and not through statute. And folks like Ted Kennedy said, no, we can also do it through statute, through the 14th Amendment. And ultimately that was the question that went to the Supreme Court. But at that point, it had become so popularized that it wasn't about lowering the voting age. It was about the pathway, the proper approach to doing so. Mm-hmm. But I think it took a while for folks to kind of catch on to the concept itself. So, it's not the case that in 1942, when it was first introduced, that this was like a no-brainer, that people were, that they were behind it, because it kept dying. The proposal kept dying in committee. And folks just didn't believe in it. And I think that there was just not the sense of urgency around the effort. It was until young people were really stepping up. And then, we had the massacres that took place by the Klan of Andrew Goodman and two other Northerners who went down in Freedom Summer. That captured the mass media attention as well. But I think that's a kind of the boiler, and these were young people that went down that were kind of called to action in summer of 1964. But I think that the hook, I want to kind of tie it back to the 28th. I think that the hook is that it became so popularized and so discussed during times of warfare because of the direct connection with military conscription and the idea that these people can go to fight but can't go to vote. And, I think that the elections are natural hooks for the 28th Amendment when we're looking at the unprecedented flood of money and the positive stories that result from successful reforms. I think that when we have successful reforms, we celebrate them. We have to celebrate them, even if it's a small reform, because it's so hard to even get those. But we don't necessarily dedicate as much time to studying the positive impacts of them as we do studying the negative impacts in more repressive states. And so I think that those are all natural hooks for generating discussion and interest around the flood of money in politics, is the actual elections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really powerful parallel to make. And every election seems like it's more expensive than the last. And that's when the media is going to be covering this, and that's when people are going to be, more and more aware of what's going on with money in politics. We've got time for one, maybe two more questions.
And Stuart, can I just add a little bit to that, just very briefly?
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is so is also kind of captures people's attention is when these repressive bills are introduced and ultimately passed. if it's on the federal level or on the state level. So we can generally all agree that locking children in cages is a bad idea. But how do you tie that to money in politics? Well, we can look at the privatization of the detention center system and the increased funding of the legislators that accept that money, right? That accept the money in terms of like their campaign finances. And so, and we can draw that in so many different examples, not just like immigration reform. And we can draw it also, I mean, we can kind of draw it across the board, right? We can also draw it if it's like issues related to criminal justice on the local level, and if there's an election for the county district attorney, for example, or county judges, right? So there's the issue of money in politics applies to people that we might not currently see reflective in our work, even though they themselves know that this is an issue for them. But this is such a rich area for coalition building, including in times of crisis that are independent of the election cycles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. Let's go to Andrew, who's had his hand up for a while. Andrew, you're unmuted here. Where are you calling in from, and what's your question?
Okay, yeah, I'm calling in from Ohio. I live near the Kent State University campus. Been talking a lot about the young people and what happened, with the 26th Amendment, which is a very large frame. Despite young people getting the vote and a lot of activism surrounding the Vietnam War, we had 4 students killed here on the Kent State University campus, May 4th, 1970. I would encourage everybody on the call, if you're ever in Ohio, there is a visitors and center and museum for that event. And we're talking about, ratification. If you're ever in the Seneca Falls area, please go to the Women's Suffrage Museum in New York, where the women, got the vote, and study the exhibits there. The people that worked on that had no internet. They had no email. They had no telephones. But they were able to marshal huge numbers of people. We're coming off of this protest this week nationwide, which we did here in Ohio, where, we were so exhausted after this recent election, but we were asked to go out in the streets again.
And Andrew, really quickly, can you just ask your question just as
right now?
Okay, great.
There's been a lot of reference to young people here, and as we debrief from this week's protests, the majority of the people that were on the streets this week were over 40, over 50, over 60, over 70 years old, people with canes and walkers. And so what we're hearing from these 900 protests nationwide is, where are the young people? I've heard a lot on this call about the young people. We're trying to address that here locally, and I'm not sure young people, in quotations, is necessarily the solution I see right now. I think we have to pass the torch to the young people, and they're not picking it up in the view of many of our organizers. That's my question to fill out the frame here.
Mm-hmm. And are you talking about with regard to the Mueller, the emergency protest responding to the Mueller investigation?
Exactly, but I would say, activism in general. And there was a big question mark prior to the election whether the millennials would come out and vote at all. So when you refer back to the 1960s and the 1970s and the era of activism, that I grew up in, and what happened in the country after the Kent State massacre, I'm just not seeing that level of activism in young people here.
Great, and I'll let you quickly address that, Yael, before we keep going on with the call. But I think that's a good question to end this Q&A on. It's a tough one and certainly an important one.
Sure. So I think that you're right that there are certain efforts and movements that young people are not finding their way into. You know, there are some organizations that the majority of their membership is kind of older, primarily white citizens, right? But that doesn't mean that other folks are not engaged. They're just engaged in different spaces. So I see young people leading a lot of the fight around climate change, around Black Lives Matter, around, you know, mass response to detention and deportations that are taking place. You know, there were young folks that were out protesting on Inauguration Day or leading the, you know, the Parkland High School students are leading efforts too. So I don't think that the answer is simply that we have to engage young people and then these problems will be solved. I just think that they are a critical factor in involving within our democracy movements. And as a former, I got involved as a college organizer, you know. So I was a young person, kind of engaged in a variety of efforts stemming from, you know, rent control to funding for higher education to anti-war. That was just my, you know, it was like the early 2000s, and so. I think that young people are involved, but they might not be showing up in those specific spaces that you're in, and that there's a lot, that just means that there's an opportunity for coalition work. And sometimes what that looks like is actually engaging with them where they are and trying to show them, not by kind of, you know, like engaging with them as peers and trying to encourage them to, you know, pay attention to other issues that they might be thinking about the issue in general, but not applying it within the particular campaign that you're working on. I actually think there's a lot of room for growth there, such as, you know, reaching out to the folk. I'm sure that there's like progressive students, or there's even just students that are engaged in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party at Kent State, where like a forum could be organized, for example, to talk about these issues. That's cross-party lines to kind of discuss like the shared values found within the 28th Amendment. That's just as an example. So I think that a part of bridging that gap is actually looking for where the young people are and trying to engage with them there. And that's just kind of a critical component of coalition building. Because I do see young people participating and leading, but I also hear what you're saying, that they're not engaged in certain spaces. And the question that's presented is, how do we engage them, and how do we make this interesting enough and relevant enough for them to get really passionate behind? And there are certain networks that young people are self-mobilized within, including democracy efforts. So maybe this is just an opportunity for further, like, deeper coalition building and trust building with their leadership and also with their members.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell everyone on the call I'm trying to get all my other fellow 24-year-old friends interested in this effort, and it's not so hard. You know, there's a whole lot of excitement bubbling up. And I just want to thank everyone really for the fantastic and important questions, and really extend a huge thank you to you, Yael, for taking the time to be here with us and sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, you know, looking back to what we can learn from the 26th Amendment and ability to connect related issues to the 28th Amendment and talk about the importance of coalition building is absolutely paramount and will be paramount for our success. And I just want to, you know, move on, and before we get to our grassroots victory, share some of really the exciting actions, you know, as this water continues to warm, closing in on a boil, that APA members have had recently or last year. APA members had 17 meetings with elected officials or their staff, and already so far this year we've had 130, really just exponential growth, which is exciting to see. Similarly, last year APA members had 26 media pieces published, and last month alone we had 7, for a total of 85 so far already this year. Our goal is 106, and we're right on pace to make that goal over 4 times what we accomplished last year. So just a huge congratulations so far to everyone, and it's no time to let up, but rather double down. And we want to make sure that we know about these meetings with elected officials and media pieces published so we can include them in totals for next month. So if you have a meeting with an elected official or have a media piece published, please go to connect.americanpromise.net, and on the Action Center drop-down menu, you'll see the Citizen Uprising reporting forms options, where you can select the proper reporting form and let us know about your meetings or media piece or even a public event or a local resolution. And I'm now really thrilled to turn it over to Ben Gubitz, American Promise's political director, to share about really just a major, major recent victory in Massachusetts. Hey there, Ben.
Hello, Azer, and hello to all. I hope everyone is doing well and has gotten some rest since last Tuesday. As Azer said, I wanted to just share briefly for those that don't know this huge and historic victory that we just had for a 28th Amendment with the ballot initiative campaign right here in Massachusetts. For those that don't know, Massachusetts over the past about 18 months or more citizen leaders here in the state have been working to place this question on the ballot, and then of course to win the initiative, we had close to 1,000 volunteers gather about 130,000 signatures in all 351 towns in Massachusetts to actually make it onto the ballot. And once this question actually did make it onto the ballot, it was an incredibly effective volunteer campaign. We really put to test the notion that you needed millions of dollars to run an effective ballot campaign. We spent well under $200,000, while the other 2 questions in Massachusetts totaled up to about $40 million. We did this through really, unprecedented volunteer action. The question on Tuesday passed at 71%. In all of those 351 towns that I just mentioned, they all voted in the affirmative, including some of those towns that are heavily Republican districts and towns, voted in affirmative of the question. So question 2 won with popular support in all 351 towns in Massachusetts, which is just incredible, and a real testament to the work that all of the volunteers all across the state put into this, and calling their neighbors, sending postcards, holding events, tabling, really engaging the public. And this really ties into a lot of the things that Yael was talking about in terms of making, mainstreaming this movement, making it popular, and making sure that everyone, is talking about, this issue of money in politics. A volunteer shortly after the victory on Tuesday said something really interesting to me. They said that, wow, what was so incredible was through my effort out gathering signatures and placing this question on the ballot, what I was able to do was to give 4.5 million people in my state the opportunity to voice their support for a 28th Amendment. That's real empowerment. I mean, think about how incredible that is, and what a great feeling that must have been for that, for that brave volunteer that was out collecting signatures in the rain and the hot sun, and the fact that this effort gave voice to literally 4.5 million people in the state is just remarkable, and that's how we sustain this momentum and keep this momentum going. Through the signature collection process, we collected 130,000 signatures to keep this, or to put this question on the ballot, and that's really 130,000 conversations that we had with our neighbors and friends and teachers and people at the farmers markets and libraries, all about this really historic effort for a 28th Amendment. And so this is real momentum. It was incredible to see. And the question in Massachusetts actually took it a couple steps further than what has been previously passed by ballot initiative in other states. That's Washington and California in 2016 and Colorado and Montana in 2012, where those questions were advisory measures and of course still historic wins. But the question in Massachusetts actually established a volunteer nonpartisan citizens commission that will continue to research and report on dark money being spent in Massachusetts elections, make recommendations on language to the Massachusetts congressional delegation for a 28th Amendment, hold our elected officials accountable to the will of the people, and then ensure swift ratification when this amendment does come back to the states to be ratified. So it's all about kind of sustaining this momentum and keeping people engaged and keeping the 28th Amendment in the conversation. And I really think that what we're going to see with this great effort here in Massachusetts, that this could really have a ripple effect all across the country. We're going to be looking at other states for 2020 that a similar question might make sense, and perhaps Michigan and Ohio, maybe other places. But we're seeing just historic numbers of democracy reform efforts hit the ballot. There's redistricting reform, ranked choice voting, automatic voter registration, all different kinds of reforms that are all kind of driving each other. And it really is starting to seem like our moment is now. Something that Yael was talking a little bit about was, how long it actually took the 26th Amendment to be ratified from when it was introduced, just a little bit over 30 years. We are, 2 years into a 10-year game plan, and I think that we're right on track. I don't think that this 28th Amendment will take as long as the 26th did, because I think that we've learned so much from past movements. We have so many new and interesting and amazing tools that are available to us to organize. And it's just and question 2 is a prime example of people really stepping up and leaning in to make sure that this is top of mind on every voter's mind as they head to the polls. We'll continue to make that push, through 2020, and with the 116th Congress coming in January. It's so important that we stay engaged. Democracy is as the League of Women Voters say, is not a spectator sport. It's all about people staying engaged, and it's we can't just go home after the election and then show up 2 years from now, right? We have so much work to do in between now and 2020, and with the Democrats taking back the House in this midterm, I think it's very likely that we see multiple hearings in the Judiciary Committee in the House, and most likely the vote on a 28th Amendment proposal on the House floor, which is going to be incredible. And our job is to make sure that we keep this cross-partisan momentum alive. That this does not be, that the recent, quote unquote blue wave doesn't further kind of make this issue partisan, because this isn't a Republican thing. This isn't a Democratic thing. This is an American thing. The popular support is there, as evident from this question in Massachusetts and just polling all across the country. So we have so much work to do to make sure that we have Democrats, Republicans, and Independents in Congress signing on to the amendment proposals as we head into the 116th Congress. And the Citizen Commission established by the Massachusetts ballot question will certainly help us and allow us to do that. So that's just a quick update. If you have any questions about how we did this in Massachusetts or what the impact of the Citizen Commission are going to be, feel free to shoot me an email, beng@americanpromise.net. That's beng@americanpromise.net. And I'm going to turn it over right now to Citizen Empowerment Coordinator at American Promise, Waboy Gatheroo. Waboy was actually the the person on this call most responsible for making this ballot initiative happen, with coordinating all of the volunteer effort across the state, organizing events and endorsements, and just did absolutely incredible and heroic work, boy. So congratulations to you, and I'm happy to kick it on over to you. And again, if there's any questions that folks have about the ballot initiative process or how do we get this going in my state, shoot me an email at beng@americanpromise.net, and boy, on over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. It really wasn't about me. I was just helping all the volunteers and doing this great initiative for our state. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and thank you, Yael, for your great insight into one of the most important amendments that we've ever had in our country, and how it can help us look forward to the 28th Amendment. So this is really, the Yes on 2 campaign was quite a campaign and really incredible to be a part of it. And again, if there's anybody on the call who would like to do something similar in their state, be sure to reach out to Ben or myself. Okay, so let's go over this month's action, which is writing letters to the editor, reminding people that just because midterms are over, civic action is still needed, and groups like American Promise are actively working to solve the fundamental problems hurting our democracy, which is money and politics. So in your letter, be sure to include a specific event or meeting time, and be sure to direct folks for where they can go to make sure that they are still civically engaged. So this would be a great time to engage people with your upcoming outreach event or your meeting, or if you have a book club, that kind of a thing. Make sure you give people a direct avenue as to how they can get involved. This is an opportunity to engage with people who may feel as though they don't know what to do after midterms. So invite them to learn more about how your APA is helping to combat money in politics. For those writing newspapers that require responding to an article or an editorial, again, just be sure to look into recently published articles that allow you to have a really great segue into talking about a money in politics issue. For example, perhaps your newspaper has just published a study on the estimated amount of money spent in your local election. So that's a really easy way to tie in the issue of money in politics, and you can express how attending your group's event or meeting is a way to help combat the problem. And of course, once you submit your letter to the editor and it's published, be sure to let us know by filling out a citizen reporting form. So go to connect.americanpromise.net, and on the Action Center drop-down menu, you'll see the Citizen Uprising Reporting Form. So just be sure to fill out the right form so we can include your published LTE in our next month's total. All right, so now I'm going to pass it over to Azer, who's going to lead us through the second part of the training of the call.
Great, thank you, Aboy, and everyone. The action sheet that we're referring to was sent out to all of you by email yesterday, and we'll send it out again in a recap email on probably Tuesday morning of this next week. I'm now going to talk about how to set up Google alerts to monitor keywords from your local newspapers, which can be helpful for sort of flagging, these tie-ins that Aboy is talking about, not by scanning the newspaper yourself, but there's a little notification in your inbox because X, Y, and Z words were said. Oftentimes editors will print letters to the editors, as Aboy said, if there's a local tie-in, and having these alerts automatically sent to you every time, say the Columbus Dispatch publishes the word corruption or campaign spending, it'll really give you a consistent stream of current events to prompt opportunities for letters to the editor on the 28th Amendment. And again, these detailed instructions for how to really set this up, it's not hard, but there's some sort of technical importance with spacing and quotation marks, and you input the name of the newspaper. It's all laid out in that action sheet, or at the end of the action sheet, I should say. But really quickly, I just wanted to open it up to the call, asking if anyone had set up keyword alerts like this before, or even more broadly, if as you're scanning the newspaper, as you're just reading the newspaper, maybe what's a key word you'd look out for if you were trying to make the connection to money in politics and a potential segue, as Aboy said, to the 28th Amendment. I see a couple people with their hands up. It might have been for a previous question, but Chet, I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you. Just let folks know where you're calling in from, and just maybe an idea of one or two key words that you might scan for in a newspaper to make this type of connection. Chet, you're unmuted here.
I was raised for the other person. I had a couple of questions, but we ran out of time. So you can give my time to someone else who's wanting to listen.
No problem. Yeah, of course, Chet. And if you want to follow up with those specific questions to me, I'm sure I could connect you with Yael after the fact. But great. If anyone has any key words that they would want to share, that they might scan for as they're looking through their local newspapers, please go ahead and press 1 on your keypad. Give folks a couple seconds here. Great. It looks like Maggie Singer. Maggie Singer, nice to hear from you. Where are you calling in from, and what's one of these keywords you're thinking of?
Hello, Azor. We've seen each other at the Right Brain Brewery when you came there for your
I remember.
little thing. Yeah. I guess the word I come to, I don't know. You hesitate being negative, but corruption. I mean, to me, that's exactly what happens. You know, when there's too much money, you know, in politics and at the top and in government, and money is ruling. Now we know is ruling our government. Corporations and big money are making all the decisions, and so to me, corruption is a word, although it may have some negative negative thoughts when people hear that word.
Yeah, you know, I think you're spot on, Maggie. You know, that's one of the words that I personally monitor on my own. You know, I've got a couple set up. You know, I get a notification every day, when any website publishes the words 28th Amendment or corruption. Citizens United is another one I use. I even type in American Promise. I like to see what's being said about us.
But see, those two words, those two phrases sound positive. And so did, when you think about it, so did Citizens United. That sounded
true.
positive.
That is
and
true.
The way they proposed it at the beginning sounded all lovey-dovey. Well, aren't we wonderful? And then you figure out what it's really all about. You know, so that's the underlying, criminal element that I think we can't deny. And so, but then when people start to get angry, then things happen. So I don't know.
Yeah, well,
words are powerful. We know that.
They certainly are, and it oftentimes takes sort of a skeptical eye to cut through, what's truly positive and what's truly sort of insidious. And it sounds like you've got that sort of skeptic nature pretty figured out, as do most everyone, I'd imagine, on this call who are interested in this work, which is just key. We've only got about 2 minutes left here, but again, this is listed on, it's the end of the action sheet, which you all have in your inbox from yesterday, and will be recirculated around on Tuesday. And it looks like one more person wants to quickly share, just maybe one word or 2 words in, about 30 seconds or less. Jack Wyatt, you're unmuted again here. Thanks for volunteering. Jack, are you with us? All right, well, we'll come back to Jack.
There you go. Okay. Dark money.
Dark money, perfect. I think that would be a fantastic one. Dark money, you'd probably get a whole lot of good articles about the recent PBS documentary, and probably a lot of articles about money flowing in anonymously, across state lines, across country lines, impossible to know from who knows who. Some other good ones off the top of my head might be opioid crisis, say. And another one, Maggie, that's not positive at all, but is certainly going to be a really powerful tie-in to make for the 28th Amendment And again, in this little description that's at the end of the action sheet, it'll explain how you can actually, target keywords, but also say, and these are the newspapers I want them to be looking through. So I get an email every day that says, anytime Citizens United, say, is used from the publications, either the Boston Globe, Wicked Local, or the Boston Herald. And hopefully these consistent updates will really just be yet another tool to strengthen your cues on writing letters to the editor, to build your civic advocacy chops, building power in your APA, all around this goal of winning a 28th Amendment campaign to affirm that money isn't speech and constitutional rights are for people, not nonprofits, not unions, and certainly not corporations. So it's 2 p.m. here on the East Coast, you guys. As always, we'll end our call on time. So stay afterwards with your group and complete this action sheet. Take a look at it. And I'm going to take everyone off mute so we can all say goodbye, and I'll talk to you all next month, if not sooner. So going to unmute everyone. And goodbye, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your Saturday, and talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Good afternoon.
I can't wait to monitor those keywords and see all these letters to the editor coming from all these folks on the call.